What if everything you thought you knew about someone was wrong? What if a single decision could change not just your life, but the lives of everyone around you? Stay with us to discover a story that will leave you questioning everything you believe about second chances. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Margaret Chen stared at the stack of resignation letters on her desk, her hands trembling slightly as she counted them again. 7 employees had quit Riverside Diner in the past 2 weeks, leaving her critically understaffed during the busiest season of the year. The autumn festival was approaching, and tourists would flood the small town of Millbrook expecting the warm hospitality her family restaurant was known for. We really need more help," said Sarah, her remaining waitress, exhaustion evident in her voice. "I can't keep covering double shifts." Margaret nodded, understanding the weight of desperation in Sarah's plea. At 52, she had been running the diner for 15 years since her husband's death, and had never faced such a crisis. The classified ads had yielded only 2 responses in 3 weeks, both from candidates who didn't show up for their interviews. As she locked up that evening, Margaret noticed a folded piece of paper tucked under the front door. Her heart sank as she unfolded it, expecting another resignation. Instead, she found a handwritten job application in neat, careful script. The name at the top read Marcus Thompson, and everything seemed normal until her eyes reached the bottom section. Under criminal history, he had written in bold letters, "Yes, we'll explain in person." Margaret's first instinct was to crumple the paper and throw it away. But something about the honesty stopped her. In a town where most people tried to hide their flaws, here was someone willing to be upfront about his past. She folded the application carefully and slipped it into her purse, knowing that tomorrow would bring a decision that would change everything. Marcus Thompson arrived at Riverside Diner 15 minutes early, his pressed shirt and polished shoes contrasting sharply with the nervous energy radiating from his tall frame. Margaret watched him through the window as he paced outside, checking his watch repeatedly before finally entering with a deep breath. "Mrs. Chen? I'm Marcus Thompson," he said, extending his hand with a firm grip. His voice was deeper than she'd expected, carrying a slight accent she couldn't place. Margaret gestured to a corner booth, studying his face as they sat down. He appeared to be in his mid-30s, with kind eyes that seemed to hold stories she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. "I appreciate your honesty on the application, Mr. Thompson. Most people would have left that section blank. I won't lie to you, I served 8 years for armed robbery." Marcus's directness made Margaret flinch slightly. "But I've been clean for 2 years now, and I need this chance." 8 years is a long time," Margaret said carefully. "What makes you think you're ready for this responsibility?" Marcus pulled out a worn folder containing certificates from prison programs, culinary arts, anger management, literacy tutoring. "I learned to cook inside. Helped in the kitchen for 6 years. I know it's not the same as running a real restaurant, but I've got skills and I'm willing to work harder than anyone you've ever hired." Margaret felt the weight of the empty dining room around them. She thought of Sarah's exhausted face, the upcoming festival, the bills piling up on her desk. Against every instinct screaming at her to say no, she heard herself asking, "When can you start?" The relief that washed over Marcus's face was so profound that Margaret wondered what story lay behind those 8 years, and whether she was making the biggest mistake of her life. Word traveled fast in Millbrook. By the time Marcus finished his first shift, news of the ex-convict working at Riverside Diner had spread through the town like wildfire. Margaret discovered just how fast when she arrived the next morning to find Police Chief Robert Hayes waiting by her door. "Margaret, what the hell are you thinking?" Robert's weathered face was creased with concern. "You can't just hire dangerous criminals without warning the community." "He's not dangerous, Robert. He was honest about his past, and I need the help." Margaret unlocked the door, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. "Honest about armed robbery, you mean?" came a sharp voice from behind them. Councilwoman Patricia Blackwood approached with her usual air of authority, her heels clicking against the pavement. "Margaret, this is incredibly irresponsible. What about our children? Our elderly residents?" Margaret felt her cheeks burn. "Patricia, he's washing dishes and prepping vegetables. He's not robbing banks." "Yet," Patricia replied coldly. "I'm calling an emergency town meeting for tomorrow night. The community deserves to know about this decision. As the two officials left, Margaret noticed several regular customers crossing the street to avoid walking past her diner. Mrs. Kowalski, who had eaten lunch there every Tuesday for 10 years, deliberately looked away when Margaret waved. Inside, Marcus was already at work, his movements efficient and precise as he prepared the morning's vegetables. If he had noticed the confrontation outside, he gave no sign of it. But Margaret caught him glancing toward the window more than once, and she wondered if he could feel the weight of the town's suspicion pressing against the glass like a storm waiting to break. The morning rush brought only half the usual customers, and those who came ate quickly, avoiding eye contact with Marcus whenever he emerged from the kitchen. The emergency town meeting drew the largest crowd Margaret had seen at City Hall in years. She sat in the front row, feeling every pair of eyes boring into her back as Patricia Blackwood called the meeting to order. Marcus had offered to come, but Margaret had insisted he stay away, not wanting to subject him to what she knew would be a hostile crowd. "We're here to discuss Margaret Chen's reckless decision to employ a convicted felon," Patricia began, her voice carrying easily through the packed room. "This man committed armed robbery, a violent crime that endangered innocent lives." The crowd murmured agreement, but Margaret was surprised when elderly Mr. Petrosky raised his hand. "Now hold on, Patricia. Armed robbery doesn't always mean what you think it means." "Frank, please," Patricia dismissed him, but the old man stood up anyway. "My grandson was arrested for armed robbery 5 years ago," Frank continued, his voice shaking slightly. "Turned out he was 17, desperate for drug money, and used a fake gun. Scared a store clerk, got 8 years just like this Marcus fellow. The boy's turned his life around since." Margaret felt a spark of hope as she noticed several people nodding thoughtfully. Then another voice spoke up, Dr. Emily Rodriguez, the town's newest physician. "I've worked with former inmates at the county clinic," Dr. Rodriguez said. "The recidivism rate drops dramatically when people find stable employment. Margaret might be preventing crime, not encouraging it." "That's ridiculous psychobabble," Patricia snapped, but her authority was wavering. Then Sarah, Margaret's waitress, stood up. "I've worked with Marcus for 3 days now. He's polite, hardworking, and he helped me when I cut my hand without even being asked. Judge actions, not history." As the crowd began to divide into heated discussions, Margaret realized that Millbrook wasn't as unified in its prejudice as she'd feared. But she also noticed the cold stares from several prominent business owners, and she knew the battle for Marcus's acceptance was far from over. 2 weeks into Marcus's employment, strange things began happening at Riverside Diner. Margaret arrived each morning to find small tasks completed that she hadn't assigned, the walk-in cooler organized, the coffee machine deep-cleaned, inventory counted and recorded in neat handwriting. When she asked Marcus about it, he seemed genuinely confused. "I only do what you tell me to do, Mrs. Chen. Maybe Sarah's been coming in early." But Sarah worked the day shift and had her own key. Margaret began to suspect Marcus was lying, working unpaid hours to prove his worth. She decided to catch him in the act. Margaret parked across the street at 2 a.m., watching the dark diner. After an hour, she saw a figure moving around inside with a small flashlight. Anger flared in her chest. She had specifically told all employees that working unauthorized hours was forbidden. She marched across the street, key ready. "Marcus, I told you," she began as she flicked on the lights, then stopped dead. The person standing in her kitchen wasn't Marcus at all. It was a teenage girl, maybe 16, with Marcus's same dark eyes and stubborn chin. She was wearing a Riverside Diner apron over clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in days. "Please don't call the police," the girl whispered, dropping a scrub brush into the sink. "I was just trying to help my dad." "Your dad?" Margaret's mind raced. Marcus had never mentioned having children.
"I'm Zoe Thompson."
"My dad doesn't know I've been coming here. He thinks I'm staying with friends." The girl's voice cracked. "I just wanted to help him keep this job. I know what people are saying about him." Margaret sank into a chair, overwhelmed by this new complication. "Where have you been living, Zoe?" "Around," Zoe said evasively, but Margaret caught sight of a sleeping bag tucked behind the prep table and understood. This girl had been homeless, sneaking into the diner to help her father and probably to find a warm place to sleep. Everything Margaret thought she knew about Marcus Thompson had just become infinitely more complicated. Margaret made Zoe a cup of hot chocolate and wrapped her in a clean kitchen towel while she decided what to do. The girl was clearly exhausted, malnourished, and scared, but also fiercely protective of her father. "How long has it been since you've seen Marcus?" Margaret asked gently. 3 years, Zoe admitted, tears streaming down her face. "He doesn't even know I'm in town. When he got out of prison, I was living with my aunt in Portland. But she died last month, and foster care. I ran away to find him." "Why didn't you just go to him directly?" Zoe wiped her nose with the towel. "Because I know he's trying to start over. I heard what people say about ex-cons. I didn't want to make it harder for him." She looked up at Margaret with desperate eyes. "He's a good man, Mrs. Chen. He went to prison because of me." Margaret felt her heart skip. "What do you mean?" "When I was 13, I got sick. Really sick. Dad didn't have insurance, couldn't afford the medicine I needed. So he did something stupid. He never told me the details, but I knew. He robbed that store to pay for my treatment." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Marcus hadn't been a career criminal or a violent man. He'd been a desperate father trying to save his daughter's life. And now that daughter was homeless, believing she was protecting him by staying away. "Zoe, your father needs to know you're here. He needs to know you're safe." "But what if it ruins everything for him? What if he loses this job because of me?" Margaret looked at this brave, broken girl who had been cleaning her restaurant in secret, trying to help the father who didn't even know she was nearby. "Sweetie, family is never a burden. It's what makes us fight to be better." As dawn approached, Margaret made a decision that would either heal a fractured family or destroy the fragile new life Marcus had been building in Millbrook. Margaret called Marcus before his shift, asking him to come in early for an important conversation. She watched through the kitchen window as he walked up the street, his posture straight and confident, so different from the nervous man who had interviewed just weeks ago. That confidence was about to be tested. "Mrs. Chen, is everything okay?" Marcus asked as he entered, immediately noticing Margaret's serious expression. "There's someone here who needs to see you," Margaret said softly, stepping aside. Zoe emerged from behind the counter, and Margaret watched as 8 years of separation collapsed in an instant. Marcus's face went through a dozen emotions: shock, joy, confusion, fear, before he dropped to his knees and opened his arms. "Zoe, baby girl, where have you been?" His voice broke as she ran to him, and Margaret had to turn away from the intensity of their embrace. After several minutes of tears and whispered conversations, Margaret learned the full story. Marcus had been a single father since Zoe was 8, working 2 jobs to make ends meet. When Zoe developed a rare kidney condition requiring expensive medication, their insurance denied coverage, calling it experimental treatment. "I tried everything legal first," Marcus explained, his arm still wrapped protectively around his daughter. "Fundraising, charity applications, medical loans. But she was getting worse every day, and the doctors said we were running out of time." "So you robbed a pharmacy," Margaret said quietly. "A check-cashing place, actually. I thought it would be easier, less chance of hurting someone." Marcus's voice was heavy with old shame. "I was wrong about everything. Got caught immediately, and the money didn't even cover half of what we needed." Zoe squeezed her father's hand. "But Mrs. Patterson, our neighbor, she started a fundraiser after Dad was arrested. The whole community came together. I got my treatment, and I got better." "Then why didn't you stay together when he was released?" "Because I was 17 by then, and the state said I was better off in foster care with my aunt," Zoe explained. "They said Dad's record made him unsuitable as a guardian." Margaret felt anger rising in her chest, not at Marcus, but at a system that had torn apart a family and kept them separated even after they'd both paid such a heavy price for one desperate decision. Patricia Blackwood arrived at Riverside Diner the next morning with Officer Johnson and a clipboard full of official-looking papers. Margaret watched through the window as they approached, knowing this confrontation had been inevitable. "Margaret, "We've received reports of suspicious activity at your establishment," Patricia announced loudly enough for other customers to hear. "Late-night disturbances, unauthorized personnel on the premises." "I can explain," Margaret began, but Patricia cut her off. "We're conducting a formal investigation into whether you're violating the terms of your business license by allowing vagrants and potentially dangerous individuals unsupervised access to your facility." Marcus emerged from the kitchen, and Margaret saw him instinctively step in front of Zoe, who was wiping down tables nearby. "Mrs. Blackwood, if you have questions about my conduct, please direct them to me." "Oh, I have many questions, Mr. Thompson. Starting with why an unregistered minor has been living on these premises." Margaret felt her heart sink. Someone had seen Zoe coming and going from the diner and reported it. "Patricia, you're making this sound worse than it is." "Am I?" "Because from where I stand, it looks like you're harboring a runaway in an unlicensed situation, possibly putting our entire community at risk." Dr. Rodriguez, who had been sitting quietly in a corner booth, stood up and approached the group. "Councilwoman Blackwood, as a mandated reporter, I'm obligated to ensure this young woman's welfare. But I don't see any signs of neglect or abuse here." "Dr. Rodriguez, please don't interfere with official town business." "This is medical business now," Dr. Rodriguez replied firmly. "Zoe, would you mind if I examined you to make sure you're healthy and safe?" As Dr. Rodriguez led Zoe to a private booth, Margaret noticed several regular customers watching the scene unfold. Some looked sympathetic, others seemed vindicated in their earlier suspicions about Marcus. But one customer in particular caught her attention. Elderly Mr. Petrosky was making notes in a small notebook, his expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. Margaret realized that whatever happened next would determine not just Marcus and Zoe's future, but the entire character of her community. Dr. Rodriguez's examination revealed what Margaret had suspected. Zoe was malnourished and exhausted, but not abused or neglected. More importantly, the young doctor discovered something that changed everything: surgical scars consistent with kidney surgery, and medication bottles in Zoe's backpack that told a story Patricia Blackwood hadn't expected. "Councilwoman, I think you need to see this," Dr. Rodriguez said quietly, showing Patricia the medical records Zoe had been carrying. "This girl has been managing a serious chronic condition largely on her own for months." Meanwhile, Mr. Petrosky approached Margaret with his notebook. "I've been doing some research on your Marcus Thompson," he said. "Turns out there's more to his story than anyone bothered to learn." He handed Margaret a printout from the local library's computer. It was a newspaper article from 8 years ago: "Local father arrested trying to save daughter's life. Community rallies for medical expenses." Margaret read with growing amazement. The article described Marcus as a devoted single father, a volunteer at the local food bank, and a man who had exhausted every legal option before resorting to crime. It included statements from neighbors, teachers, and medical professionals, all describing his character and desperation. "Why didn't anyone remember this?" Margaret asked. "Because it happened in the next county over, and people forget the details, remember only the crime," Mr. Petrosky explained. "But I remembered something feeling familiar about his story." Patricia Blackwood's face had gone pale as she read the medical records and the newspaper article. Officer Johnson was looking increasingly uncomfortable with the situation he'd been called to investigate. "Mrs. Blackwood," Marcus said quietly, "I know my past makes people nervous. But I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm just asking for the chance to take care of my daughter and contribute to this community." "Your daughter was living in an unlicensed situation," Patricia said weakly, "but her earlier authority was gone." "My daughter was surviving," Marcus replied. "Now she has a chance to thrive, if this community will let her." Dr. Rodriguez closed her medical bag and stood up. "I'm recommending that Zoe remain in her father's care, with proper housing arrangements and continued medical monitoring. This family has been through enough separation." 3 months later, Riverside Diner was busier than it had been in years. Marcus had been promoted to assistant manager, and his innovative menu additions had earned the restaurant a feature in the regional tourism guide. More importantly, the community had slowly begun to embrace both him and Zoe. Margaret watched from behind the counter as Zoe helped elderly customers to their seats and chatted easily with the teenage customers who had initially been wary of her. The girl had enrolled in Millbrook High School and was excelling in her classes, her kidney condition stable under Dr. Rodriguez's care. "Mrs. Chen, table 6 is asking for you," Sarah called out, busier and happier than Margaret had seen her in months. At table 6 sat Mr. Petrosky with a group of other town elders, including several who had initially opposed Marcus's hiring. "Margaret, we wanted to discuss something with you," Mr. Petrosky said with a smile. "We've been talking about Marcus's situation," said Mrs. Kowalski, who had returned as a regular customer weeks ago. "A lot of us feel bad about how we reacted initially." "What Frank is trying to say," interrupted Mr. Davidson, the local hardware store owner, "is that we want to help. We're proposing Marcus for the Millbrook Community Service Award at the Fall Festival." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "Are you sure? Patricia Blackwood still chairs that committee." "Patricia's been outvoted," Mr. Petrosky said with satisfaction. "Turns out the town council wasn't as unified as she thought. Plus, Dr. Rodriguez has been very persuasive about the importance of supporting rehabilitation and family reunification." As if summoned by their conversation, Marcus appeared with a tray of fresh coffee for the table. "Is everything okay here?" he asked, noticing Margaret's emotional expression. "Everything's perfect," Margaret replied, watching as the men who had once feared him now shook his hand warmly. That evening, as Margaret locked up the diner, she found Marcus and Zoe cleaning the kitchen together, their easy conversation filling the space with warmth. They had found a small apartment above the bookstore, and Zoe had painted her room yellow because it reminded her of sunshine. "Mrs. Chen," Marcus said, looking up from the prep table, "I never thanked you properly for taking a chance on me. On us." "You thank me every day by being exactly who I hoped you were," Margaret replied. As she walked home through the streets of Millbrook, Margaret reflected on how much had changed since that desperate night when she'd found Marcus's application under her door. She had thought she was simply hiring an employee, but instead she had helped heal a family, challenged a community's prejudices, and discovered that sometimes the biggest risks lead to the most beautiful rewards. The town that had once whispered about the ex-convict at Riverside Diner now spoke proudly of the Thompson family's resilience and the manager who had seen potential where others saw only problems. Thank you for watching this incredible story of second chances, family bonds, and community transformation. What did you think about Margaret's decision to hire Marcus? Have you ever had to choose between fear and compassion? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share this story with someone who believes in the power of redemption. See you in the next video.